A learning objective should describe what students should know or be able to do at the end of the course that they opted for. Learning objectives should be about student performance. Good learning objectives should not be too abstract. That means, they should be very concrete. And then learning objectives should not be too narrow, rather they should be broad based. Also, learning objectives should not be restricted to lower level cognitive skills, but they should also take into consideration the higher order skills. Each learning objectives should support the broad goal of the course. It is suggested that the number of learning objectives be kept to not more than 6. There are several types of learning taking place. Benjamin Bloom, along with his associates, has pooled all the learning objectives and then classified them into 3 domains. According to him, they are broadly cognitive, affective and psychomotor. The cognitive domain involves knowledge and intellectual skills. This includes the recall or recognition of specific facts, procedures and concepts that foster development of intellectual abilities and skills. There are 6 major categories in the cognitive domain. They are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis and evaluation. They are listed in an order starting from the simplest behavior, that is knowledge, to the higher order behavior, that is evaluation. The first one must be mastered before the next one can take place. Let us look at the learning objectives to do with knowledge. The learner is expected to recall data or information from previously learned material by recalling facts, terms and concepts. For example, reciting a poem. A businessman quoting prices from memory to a customer. A child knowing the safety rules. These can be the objectives, learning objectives. The key words that are used in framing the objectives include defines, describes, identifies, knows, labels, lists, matches, recalls, recognizes, reproduces, selects and so on. That means, at the beginning of course, we frame the learning objectives using these words if we want to test the knowledge. So, when we want to test the knowledge objective, then at the end of the course, we frame certain questions in order to find out whether the student has mastered the subject or not. If they are related to knowledge, then typically the questions are framed using the words who, what, when, why, where, which, choose, find, how, define, label, show, spell, list, match, name, relate and so on. That is, the question would be something like, what is something and how is something, where is it and when did it happen, how did it happen, how would you explain, why did you say so and how would you describe, can you recall, can you list. So, the questions that are framed in order to test this learning objective, that is knowledge, will have words like this. Then we have comprehension. This is a higher order learning objective when compared to knowledge. In comprehension, the learner is expected to understand the meaning and interpretation of instructions and problems. State a problem in one's own words. The learner should demonstrate understanding of facts and ideas by organizing, comparing, interpreting, giving descriptions and stating main ideas. For example, a student rewrites the principles of test writing. Explain in one's own words the steps for performing a complex task. That means, the student does not stop with knowledge, but he tries to understand it more thoroughly, that is comprehension. The keywords that are used in framing the objectives include comprehends, distinguishes, explains, generalizes, infers, interprets, summarizes, translates, and so on. Similarly, to test this learning objective, that is comprehension, the questions framed usually have words like compare, contrast, explain, illustrate, infer, outline, summarize, show, classify, and so on. How would you classify the type of something? How would you compare and contrast? How will you state in your own words what is the main idea of so and so? Which statement supports your argument, or can you explain what is something? What is meant by something? How would you summarize? Like this, these questions are framed in order to test comprehension of the learner. And then we have application. Application is the learner is expected to use a concept in a new situation, applies what was learned in the classroom into a novel situation. He should be able to solve problems by applying acquired knowledge, facts, techniques, rules in a different way. For example, the student uses a calendar to calculate summer vacation. Apply laws of statistics to evaluate the reliability of a written test. Just like the other learning objectives, even for application, there are certain keywords like applies, computes, constructs, demonstrates, discovers, produces, relates, shows, solves, and so on. And whenever we want to test this learning objective, that is application, then the question usually will have words such as construct, develop, organize, experiment with, plan, select, solve, apply, choose, identify, and so on. The question then would be something like, how would you use? What examples can you find? Typical questions to test the learning objective, that is application, will have words such as apply, choose, construct, develop, organize, experiment with, plan, select, solve, identify, and so on. Then the questions that are used to test this learning objective would be something like, how would you use? What examples can you find? How would you solve using what you have already learned? How would you organize? What approach would you use? How would you apply what you have learned? What other ways would you plan to? Can you make use of the facts to do something? So, this is how the questions are framed to test the learning objective, that is application. Analysis. In case of analysis, the learner separates material or concepts into component parts so that its organizational structure may be understood. The learner, by examining and breaking information into parts, makes inferences and finds evidence to support generalizations. For example, the student troubleshoots a piece of equipment by using logical deduction, recognizes by logical reasoning. In order to test this learning objective, we use certain keywords in framing the objectives like analyzes, compares, contrasts, differentiates, discriminates, distinguishes, and identifies. Also, in framing questions, in order to identify this learning objective, the typical words that are used would be something like analyze, categorize, classify, compare, contrast, discover, dissect, divide, examine, inspect, simplify, survey, distinguish, list, distinction, theme, and so on. And the questions that are framed usually will be something like, what are the parts or features of something? How is dash related to dash? How do you think is something constructed? What is the theme? Can you list the parts? What inferences can you make? What conclusions can you draw? How would you classify? How would you categorize? Can you identify the different parts? What evidences can you find? And so on. That means, here we are interested in testing the learning objective, that is analysis. Then comes a higher order learning objective, that is synthesis, wherein the learner puts parts together to form a whole with emphasis on creating a new meaning or structure. He compiles information together in a different way by combining elements in a new pattern or proposing alternate solutions. For example, the student designs a machine to perform a specific task, integrates sources to solve a problem, revises the process to improve the outcome. The keywords that are used in framing this learning objective include categorizes, combines, compiles, composes, creates, devises, designs, explains, generates, modifies, organizes, relates, revises, and summarizes. And similarly, the questions that are framed to test this learning objective would use the words combine, compose, construct, create, design, develop, plan, solve, discuss, improve, adapt, elaborate, test, improve, or any such words. What changes would you make to solve some problem? How would you improve this machine? What would happen if this is done this way? How would you adapt something to create a different thing? How would you change or modify in order to create something new? What could be combined to improve or change it? How would you test? So, this is how information is put together in order to synthesize, that means come up with something new. And finally, the learning objective in the cognitive domain is the evaluation, wherein the learner makes judgments about the value of ideas or materials. Presenting and defending opinions by making judgments about information, he validates ideas or quality of work based on a set of criteria. For example, the student selects the most effective solution, hires the most qualified candidate, and to test these learning objectives, when we frame the objectives, the keywords that are used would be appraises, compares, concludes, contrasts, criticizes, describes, discriminates, evaluates, explains, interprets, justifies, summarizes. And then the questions that are framed to test this learning objective evaluation would have words such as choose, conclude, criticize, decide, defend, determine, evaluate, justify, compare, recommend, select, explain, prove, assess, value, estimate. So, the question would be something like, how do you prove or can you assess the importance of something? How would you rate something? How would you evaluate something? How could you determine the value of something? How would you select? How would you prioritize? This is how the 6 categories, namely knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis and evaluation are placed in a hierarchy in the cognitive domain. Let us discuss about the affective domain. This domain includes the manner in which we deal with things emotionally, such as feelings, values, motivations and attitudes. The 5 major categories that are included in the affective domain are receiving phenomena, responding to phenomena, valuing, organization and internalizing values. They are also listed from the simplest behavior to the most complex, like the other domains. Let us look at the first under the affective domain, receiving phenomena. Awareness, willingness to hear and selected attention are the things that we look for, and the examples would be listen to others with respect, listen and remember the name of newly introduced people. The keywords that are used in framing the learning objectives to find out the learning objective, that is receiving phenomena, would be using the words asks, chooses, describes, follows, gives, identifies, locates, names, selects, replies and uses. And then in responding to the phenomena, that is the next category, active participation on the part of the learners is necessary. Attends and reacts to a particular phenomenon. Learning outcomes may emphasize compliance in responding, willingness to respond, or motivation in responding. For example, participates in classroom discussion, gives a presentation, questions new ideas, concepts, models, etc., in order to fully understand them. The keywords that are used in framing this learning objective to test this learning objective would be include the words like answers, discusses, labels, performs, practices, presents, reads, recites, reports, selects, tells, and writes. Then we have the third category, what is called valuing. The worth or value a person attaches to a particular object is determined. This ranges from simple acceptance to more complex state of commitment. Valuing is based on the internalization of a set of specified values expressed in the learner's overt behavior and are often identifiable. For example, the learner demonstrates belief in the democratic process. He shows the ability to solve problems. The key words that are used in framing the learning objective include completes, demonstrates, differentiates, explains, follows, invites, justifies, proposes, reads, reports, and selects. And then comes organization. This is the fourth category under the affective domain, and it is nothing but organizing values into priorities by contrasting different values, resolving conflicts between them, and creating a unique value system. The emphasis is on comparing, relating, and synthesizing values. For example, the learner recognizes the need for balance between freedom and responsible behavior. He accepts responsibility for one's behavior, prioritizes time effectively to meet the needs of the organization, family, or the self. The keywords that are used in framing learning objectives related to organization will include words such as adheres, arranges, combines, compares, completes, explains, formulates, generalizes, identifies, integrates, modifies, organizes, relates, and synthesizes. Then we have the next category, that is called internalizing values or characterization. Has a value system that controls their behavior. The behavior is consistent, predictable, and characteristic of the learner. Instructional objectives are concerned with the student's general patterns of adjustment to the personal life, social life, and emotional life. The examples to test these learning objectives would be something like cooperates in group activities, displays a teamwork, uses an objective approach in problem solving, displays a professional commitment to ethical practice on a daily basis. The keywords that are used in framing the objectives include acts, discriminates, displays, modifies, performs, practices, proposes, questions, revises, solves, or verifies. Psychomotor domain. The psychomotor domain includes physical movement, coordination and use of the motor skill areas. Development of these skills requires practice and is measured in terms of speed, precision or technique in execution. This psychomotor domain has 7 major categories. They are perception, set, guided response, mechanism, complex overt response, adaptation and origination. They are listed again just like the other 2 domains, that is cognitive and affective domain. They are placed in a gradual sequence and increasing complexity. Perception, that is the ability to use sensory cues to guide motor activity. This ranges from sensory stimulation through cue selection to translation. For example, the learner detects non-verbal communication cues. He estimates where a ball will land after it is thrown and then moving to the correct location to catch the ball. Adjusts heat of stove to correct temperature by smell and taste of food. The key words that are used in framing the learning objectives related to perception will have words like chooses, describes, detects, differentiates, distinguishes, identifies, relates and selects. And then we have the next category, that is the set. Readiness to act, it includes mental, physical and emotional sets. These 3 sets are dispositions that predetermine a person's response to different situations. These are sometimes called the mindsets. For example, the learner knows and acts upon a sequence of steps in a manufacturing process, recognizes one's abilities and limitations. He shows desire and motivation to learn a new process. The learning objectives that are framed to identify this learning objective will begin with words like begins, displays, explains, moves, proceeds, reacts, shows, states and so on. The third stage in the psychomotor domain, that is guided response. The early stages in learning a complex skill that includes imitation and trial and error. Adequacy of performance is achieved by practicing. For example, the learner performs a mathematical equation as demonstrated. He follows instructions to build a model. The learner responds to hand signals of instructor while learning to operate a forklift. Then, to test this learning objective, the keywords that are used in framing the objectives would be copies, follows, reproduces and responds. Then we have mechanism. This is the intermediate stage in learning a complex skill. Learned responses have become habitual and the movements can be performed with some confidence and proficiency. For example, the learner uses a personal computer. He repairs a leaking tap. He drives a car. To test this learning objective, while framing the objectives, the words that are used are assembles, calibrates, constructs, dismantles, displays, fixes, manipulates, measures and organizes. Then the next under the psychomotor domain is complex overt response. The skillful performance of motor acts that involve complex movement patterns are tested. Proficiency is indicated by a quick, accurate and highly coordinated performance requiring a minimum of energy. This category includes performing without hesitation and automatic performance. For example, the learner operates a computer quickly and accurately, displays competence while playing an instrument like veena. The key words that are used in testing this learning objective will have the words such as assembles, calibrates, constructs, displays, manipulates, measures and organizes. Then the next under psychomotor domain is adaptation. Skills are well developed and the individual can modify movement patterns to fit special requirements. The examples to test this learning objective adaptation would be responds effectively to unexpected experiences, modifies instruction to meet the needs of the learners, perform a task with a machine that it was not originally intended to do. Then the learning objectives will be framed using the words such as adapts, alters, changes, rearranges, reorganizes, revises and varies. And then comes origination, that is creating new movement patterns to fit a particular situation or specific problem. Learning outcomes emphasize creativity based upon highly developed skills. For example, the learner constructs a new theory, develops a new and comprehensive training program. The key words that are used in framing the learning objective include arranges, builds, combines, composes, constructs, creates and designs. To conclude, learning objectives should be accompanied by measurable outcomes, which describe ways in which students will be asked to demonstrate that they have achieved the learning objectives. Methods of assessment of students' learning can take different forms, can be exams, written or oral, or can be seminar papers or oral presentation or team projects. The criteria for success should be developed so that they can use feedback to see where they need to strengthen their performance.